of the article is, as I'm developing it now, to see whether it is true, and I'd like to ask you this question first of all. Do you think it is true, Dr. Sagan, over the last few years that scientists and science generally have received some bad PR? I mean, there was a kind of an anti-scientism that set in, and people were blaming science for one thing or the other, blaming him for the destruction of the environment, of making an atom bomb. There was a kind of a heyday of science, and then there was a kind of a Götterdämmerung. Would you say it's true?
Well, I think what's happened is that, for one thing, people had very unrealistic expectations that science would solve problems which are fundamentally human problems and not technological problems.
You're saying there's a certain limit to the field that people should recognize.
Well, I think there's a certain limit to human beings and a certain limit to science. I hope both limits get pushed back, but at any given moment there are, of course, such limits.
How would you define that limit for science, let's say, or for your
simply
field?
the sum of what we've done up to the moment. And in the future we may be able to do a great deal more, but up to the moment we've only done so much. So I'd say, first of all, there's that, an unrealistic view of science being able to solve everything when it is, after all, just a tool, and the tool, of course, has limitations, although it's a tool which is rapidly improving. The second point is that we've gotten ourselves into some very tight corners, due not directly to science or technology, but to the misuse by politicians of science and technology. More generally speaking, the problems have arisen because the politicians have not been aware of science and technology, and therefore unexpected side effects suddenly come up. And there are many of them. Everyone knows the long litany of possible technological disasters: overpopulation, nuclear war, exhaustion of mineral and fossil fuel resources, ecological catastrophes, destruction of the ozonosphere. There's a very long inadvertent climatic modification. There's a very long list, and except for nuclear war, but perhaps even including that one, all of them are the result of the governments and politicians not being sufficiently far-sighted, not realizing that there are consequences to actions, and also not realizing that there are exponentials built into success. So, for example, one consequence of improved medical practice is more people are alive. So there's greater stress on resources and food. And people start dying of diseases that no one ever died of before because you died of something else first. Now, I think that this is part of the reason that people have become disillusioned with science. It's because there was a kind of mythological worship of science as being a possible solution to all problems. Science is not a solution, it's a method. It's a way of viewing the world. It is, in my view, the most successful way of viewing the world that's ever been invented. But that's all it is. And people have been very ready to accept the results of science, but not to accept the method. The method involves a very critical scrutiny of data, the willingness to surrender long-held beliefs, the idea that any opinion from authority has zero merit. We know enough cases of distinguished elderly gentlemen being mistaken for any argument from authority to carry any weight at all. Science teaches that all contentions are to be put to the experimental test. Nothing is to be accepted just because it seems right. Nature is the ultimate arbiter of what works and what doesn't. The method of science involves the seeking of alternative hypotheses. Many possible solutions are investigated, and if one solution is attacked, that is all to the good. because the less we have to worry about, the more that are discredited, the easier our thinking is. Well, these aspects of the methodology of science have not been accepted, have not been widely used. And that's why, in my view, such fields as politics are so immensely backward. It's because we're not interested in pursuing all conceivable alternatives and picking out the one which works best. Instead, we are locked into a maintenance of vested interests. We get into a particular way of looking at the world. The world changes, but there are people who are making intellectual or financial profit off the first way of examining the world, and they're reluctant to surrender. Well, that's not the method of science. I think that the main way in which science can help contemporary problems is not so much through the results of science, but through a more widespread use of its methodology. Sorry to give such a long answer, but it's a very tough question.
Yes. Now, you think, therefore, the answer is not so much that there should be input from scientists, but rather that other people should be trained in the scientific method themselves?
I think it's the only way of perceiving the world which has testable, verifiable validity. I mean, it works. It's the only method that works, as far as I know. Where the definition of works is something that anybody himself can test.
Mm-hmm. Now, can a person always do this entirely objectively himself? Can a person ever be a perfect user of the scientific method, being a human being?
I don't think so. I think there are too many cases in science of people getting mad when their theories are attacked for anybody to say that scientists are immune from that sort of human failing. But science is the one field which has, at least as its objective, the idea that my ideas and my self-esteem are not the same. That it's all right to attack an idea which I propose. If you're right in your attack, you've done me a favor. Okay? Now, certainly there are cases where scientists, being human, don't behave that way.
But the check and balance is in the system.
Exactly.
The guard against the person's own emotions and subjectivity.
Exactly. And that's why, for example, scientific papers are refereed, so that the author of the new idea has the benefit of critical scrutiny by his colleagues before the paper even sees print. And of course, papers are rejected, as you know, if the referees think there's enough wrong with them.
Now, should a code of ethics, or whatever you would call it, that is not entirely, in most people's minds, a scientific thing, should that be developed in the same way? What would you call your own ethical or religious base?
Well, now we're into an extremely different area. I think this has very little to do with what we were just talking about. But I'd be glad to approach it. But just ask it.
My question ultimately is whether the two touch.
What I'm talking about is to find a method of perceiving how the world works, where human beings are, of course, part of the world. We are faced with very difficult problems, and if we fail in coming to grips with them, our civilization, maybe even our species, can come to an end. So the question is not to impose some pre-existing ethical framework on the world, but to find out what works and what doesn't. Absolutely pragmatic approach. And then once we understand what works and what doesn't, then we can decide if we want to pursue one thing or another. But it seems to me the first step is to find out what works. And the scientific method, the experimental approach, the constant self-criticism, the skeptical scrutiny of alternatives, that is the only approach I know of that works. Now that seems to me to have very little to do with ethics. You can have a wide variety of ethical precepts consistent with that approach to the world.
Well, I've had some people tell me, for example, that we don't have time or funds to research everything, even in more than one lifetime, and that there ought to be some kind of ethical input as to what should be researched.
Oh, that's quite a different question. Again, but all I would say here is that those areas which are critical for the survival of the civilization, obviously, are the ones that should be researched. So, for example, to take a completely trivial one, effective birth control devices and pharmaceuticals. Clearly, that is a kind of problem which is critical, and therefore that's a thing which ought to be pursued. I don't think anyone would argue that overpopulation is not a problem. And now if we go into other areas where the practical applications are more obscure, then we might very well have debates. I think we ought to, on what ought to be pursued and what ought not to be pursued. I don't think there ought to be censorship on the pursuit of any idea, no matter how outrageous or offensive. But on the other hand, that's not to say that large national resources ought to be put into every conceivable activity. We have a finite amount of resources, and they ought to be put where they'll do the most good. I would stress that do the most good implies both short and long-term objectives. It's not enough to solve your short-term problems if you're going to hell in a handbasket in the long term. So a wise use of national resources is to concern yourself with both the short-term and the long-term problems. Pursuit of long-term problems is called basic research.
What input, let me approach it from this direction, what input do you think science is looking for from completely non-scientific disciplines, let's say philosophy, theology, things that people do not associate with science in any way, and vice versa?
I don't myself consider those disciplines. I consider them largely indisciplines. I don't think there's a great deal of rigor in those fields. And I would say that much of the greatest interest in philosophical subjects is now subsumed under science. I mean, philosophy used to deal with questions such as the nature of perception. How do we know the external world? Well, that's now called sensory physiology. And philosophy used to be involved with questions of where did the world come from, but that's now called astronomy and cosmology. And it used to be involved with questions of how can we perceive an external reality, a thing called epistemology, but that now involves areas which are called logic and other aspects of physiology. Likewise, questions of the origin of mankind and the origin of life, those all used to be in philosophy and theology. Well, they're now all parts of science. And what's left in philosophy is of some interest, but and I enjoy philosophy, but it's not, in my view, at all as vigorous and central a field as it was, say, at the time of Socrates. See, at the time of Socrates, science was part of philosophy. Today, it's quite separate. You asked before about religion, and I don't want to duck the question, but maybe you could phrase it more
Well, what you're
precisely.
saying just now, I think, is getting close to what I would like to ask. Much of what used to be in theology, you say, since that time, been found to be potentially knowable.
Yeah, exactly.
Now,
theology used to be the bin in which you put all those things you couldn't find out about.
right.
Well,
Down
now
the
we're finding.
gaps.
Right,
Yeah.
and now there's less and less there because they're in other bins.
Yeah. Is there a core, in your view, that should remain theology, or that will probably never become knowable in the sense of the scientific method?
Oh, now those are, again, two quite different things. One involves a should, and the other involves a prediction as to
Well, how do you
science
feel?
will. My feeling is that obviously there will always be things that science cannot discern. For example, if the universe is infinitely old or extends infinitely far in space, then it's a mathematical certainty that we can never know everything about it. Even if not, there are some 10 to the 20th or more stars in the universe, and that's a great many stars. I don't imagine that we'll know about all of them for the life expectancy of the Earth. So, and that's quite apart from problems which are too difficult for us to understand. I'm just saying the sheer size and immensity of the universe means there will always be things that we will not know.
Is this equivalent to saying there is a deity?
No, has no connection whatever with that point.
I mean,
It
the
just
fact
says
that
it just says that the
something we'll
universe
never
is
know.
bigger than humans can fully apprise themselves of. There's no connection with the question of God. Now, it seems to me that there are some cosmologies that imply areas which are at least difficult for traditional science to come to grips with. For example, if Big Bang cosmologies are valid, it's not at all clear that they are, but if a particular kind of Big Bang cosmology, the one in which the universe is made discontinuously from nothing 15 billion years ago, if that turns out to be the way the world was made, then what scientific status does the following question have? Quote. What was there before the universe was made? Close quote, question mark.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a question which many scientists would consider to be beyond the spirit of science. There's no experiment you can do to find out about it, so it's nothing to do with science. Or to give you another question of a similar sort, why are the physical laws the way they are? Why aren't there some other physical laws? Why is the Newtonian law of gravitation inverses the square? Why not inverses the cube? You can calculate that if it were inverses the cube, then the planets are not stable and they'd all spiral into the sun and we wouldn't be here. So one general kind of solution is that the laws of nature are the way they are, because if they're any different, we wouldn't be here. The only kind of universe that we could be in is the kind of universe that we have now. But that's not quite true. There are other possible kinds of universes which are perhaps consistent with life. But in any case, the question of doing an experiment, remember, it's always tested on the anvil of experiment science. The question of doing an experiment on why the laws of nature are the way they are is, at least from my present point of view, silly. You can't do such experiments, and therefore it's not in the realm of science. So by the rule we talked of before, if it's not in the realm of science, we can consider it in the realm of religion. And certainly traditionally, those questions, what was there before the universe was made and why is nature the way it is, have been in the province of religion. And certainly seems to me that there's nothing in science which takes them out of that province. In fact, science urges quite strongly that they have nothing to do with science. So I would say that for those who feel comfortable with that view, you certainly could have a theological approach to such questions. My own feeling is that if you can't experiment on it, anybody can say anything. And therefore, how can you distinguish one religious view from another? And therefore, what good is it? On the other hand, in the area of ethics, and even history, it's clear to me that the traditional religions, and I don't just mean the Western ones, have done a great deal of human good. They've also done a great deal of harm, but it's clear they've done a great deal of good. And I would be unhappy about a future world in which the traditional ethical precepts of religion were abandoned. I don't think there's any chance that will happen. But I just want to stress that that aspect of religions, I think, has been salutary and should be continued. But that has nothing to do with the cosmological questions we're talking about. Okay? This question is about how should human beings behave.
But you're saying everyone has some sort of ethical base, either from his background, training, or something else.
Or heredity. I would even believe that there are hereditary. Sure. I mean, certainly mother love is hereditary.
Yeah.
Nobody teaches the mother lion to lick the cub or bite the umbilical cord. She knows what to do. Okay, and that looks to us certainly like an ethical precept. I'd be surprised if there weren't such things in human beings as well. I certainly think there are hereditary predispositions towards ethical behavior. I don't say that's the whole story at all. It's clear teaching.
But it's important that they be there, you would say.
I think a society in which there are no ethical precepts is not a society. There have to be some. But at the same time, I think it's important to challenge in a mode of discussion every assumption to see if it holds up. It's the kind of assumption that works today. The fact that it worked in Babylonian times is no guarantee that it's valid today.
And this applies to ethics.
I'm I'm talking explicitly about
Yes.
ethics. The idea that somehow ethical precepts are laid down thousands of years ago and retain their validity forever is an undemonstrated proposition in my view. And we are in sufficiently complex times that I think we have to carefully consider what ethical views we want to have. And we should not have the dead hand of the past sitting on our shoulders and guiding us in a time quite different from the times in which those precepts were laid down. Those precepts were laid down by men, wise men, and women, in a time when those precepts worked. It does not follow that those same precepts have to work today.
Have you gone through a sort of ethical evolution of your own in this respect?
Well,
Or religious?
I'm not a designer of societies. I mean, Hammurabi is not my bag. So
I guess I'm saying, have you changed your views?
Oh, me myself, you mean?
Yes.
I've become much more skeptical as I've gotten older. I found out how much humbug there is in the world. I was a lot less skeptical when I was 9 years old. I believed everything they told me.
What was your own background?
In what respect?
Religiously, ethically, I mean, what kind of culture?
Well, I would say it's an American culture. Parents' religion's Jewish. Myself, from a quite early age, since I could make some judgments of my own, I set out on my own. I did ask questions reasonably early. I don't claim to have answers, but certainly still asking questions. See, there's something very comfortable about accepting a pre-digested ethos. They don't have to think anymore. It's done for you. And if that ethos works well in the world today, no reason to challenge it. But the traditional ethoses don't work. It's clear. Watergate is an excellent example of how easy it is to distort the traditional ethos so that both sides of the controversy consider themselves behaving consistently with the traditional views, just as both Christian and Saracen called upon God to aid them in their fight, each of them convinced that God was on their side and that they were performing some holy task. Well, they couldn't both have been right. And I suspect that neither was right. God couldn't have cared less, if there is a God, about to the outcome of the Crusades. In the sense that there's roughly equal insanity on both sides. And so I'm afraid I come with no answers, just with questions. But I have a very firmly developed sense that the old rules aren't working today. It's a trivial observation, but
You used the phrase, if there is a God. Would you describe your own view, an agnostic approach?
Well, it depends what you mean by God. What do you mean?
Well, that was my next question, whether you define God for yourself or whether
Well,
this
since
is necessary.
God is a word which is used to cover a wide range of different and mutually exclusive ideas, it's not seems to me unwise to simply say, do you believe in God, and then assume that both parties know what they're talking about. For example, the views range from the idea of an outsized male with a long white beard sitting on a throne in the sky to the kind of Spinozan idea that it's the sum total of the physical laws of the universe. You have to be crazy to deny that there are physical laws in the universe. So if that's what you mean by God, everybody has to believe in God. On the other hand, the evidence for the hirsute male is small, perhaps non-existent. So you have to ask, where in that intermediate continuum are you concerned about? It means a wide variety of things.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I use the word agnostic because many have told me, well, this is the person who questions.
But see,
skeptical.
Sure, but I think the evidence that there are physical laws is excellent. So I think you'd be crazy
So
to
you
be an
can't be a
agnostic.
skeptic there.
You can't be an
Yeah.
agnostic about whether
Yeah.
there's a law of gravitation. Just drop an
Yeah.
object every time.
Right.
The distance it
Except I
falls
just
goes as
finished,
square.
I had a chance to talk to Max Born just before he died,
Uh-huh.
and in fact he showed me the Born-Einstein letters just before they were published, and I just had a chance about a month ago to read them for the first time. And this controversy they had between themselves, and even Mrs. Born got involved in the question of is it a statistical universe or a deterministic one. And even though Einstein didn't like the word deterministic, he fell on that side of the fence, that he always hoped someday there would be a field theory of some kind that would
sure.
still make it a cause and effect universe.
God does not play dice with
That's
the
right,
cosmos.
right. And still Born, when I asked him directly whether his statistical view means that he ruled any kind of God out, he said by no means. It was simply a
have to be
different
crazy
way.
Now, there's any way in which you could say, here is a demonstration of the non-existence of all kinds of gods. I mean, nobody can do that because some kinds of gods demonstrably exist, like the Spinozan God. I mean, that by definition exists. As long as there's such a thing as physics, that has to be a Spinozan God. But all the other kinds of gods are not so easily demonstrated.
Of course, many, and I discovered this early in talking to these people, especially in Europe, the idea that ethics has to be related to some kind of religion is, I guess it's an American false conception. That there are many people with a strong ethical base who are not concerned about the question of God at all.
And vice versa is a point that I was trying to make before. There are many people who consider themselves God-fearing
Who are not ethical.
Exactly. I mean,
That's
we
true.
don't have to go very far into American history to find such people.
Right. Well, returning, I mean, I don't want to take a great deal more of your time. After the original question, really, that I hope the article will give some help in, and that is whether whatever we call that happened to science, the bad PR, the denouement, or whatever that I think is turning around at the present time,
So
whether something can be learned by what happened, and whether part of this answer that we're learning is that there has to be a more interdisciplinary feeling or cooperation than there has been in the past. Where there was too
I
much,
agree with that.
was there too much ivory tower stuff going on
I
before?
agree with that.
And that now we had better go off in a different direction.
Well,
What should that be?
I see. That's a good question, and I agree with the way you formulated it. On the one hand, I think there has been too much ivory tower stuff. Scientists have several kinds of obligations to explain what they're doing. One is that the obvious one, that we use public funds. The public ought to know what they're getting for their money. But much more important than that is that I think scientists have something extremely important to that has been painfully learned in the past few centuries, and which can be extremely useful in restructuring society. And that is this questioning approach to the scientific method I talked about before. We have an obligation to explain it. So I think scientists have not been nearly as active as they ought to be in explaining what they're doing, and more importantly, explaining how they go about thinking about what they're doing. The other side of the coin is if the public is to, in an age dominated by science and technology, and in a democracy, there has to be a better understanding by the public and the government of science and technology. If you look in the Senate and the House today, how many scientists are there? I think I'm temperamentally suited for that, but there must be some scientists who could be adequate, I don't say the very best, but adequate congressmen in the sort of ordinary political arena, but have that special knowledge when it comes to questions of science and technology. There are maybe 2 congressmen and no senators who have any kind of professional background. They're all lawyers and businessmen. But this is a scientific and technological age. And that kind of reflection of in the public mind of the importance of science and technology you can see all over. Look at public education. Look how poor is the understanding of science and technology there. Look at the idea of required science courses in high schools and colleges. Look how that's drifted away. There's the interesting fact that of the 3 major television networks, there's not a single person whose job it is to read the scientific literature that week to see if there's anything newsworthy. Not one person in those 3 monster networks.
I was with Jules Bergman. I did a story on the Apollo launch, and I spent some time with him in Houston when we were interviewing the men there, and he was telling me the same story. He gets closer probably for ABC as a science editor to what you're talking about.
He does virtually no science whatever. I mean, Jules Bergman does his technology. Apollo had nothing to do with science.
Right, I see what you're saying.
You see what I mean? But when was there ever a thing about a new idea that there was a program on, or a 3-minute spot in the ABC news? A marvelous new idea someone just had. Here's the way he thought about it.
I see what you're saying.
That's
I
what
see what you're
science
saying
is about.
now. And I was caught before by the statement you made that there's nothing said about how a scientist feels when he does things. Now, this, in my own teaching, has stuck out as a reason why people are considered ivory toms through the man's personality, of why he did it and how he felt. Now, how can that be overcome?
That's why in sort of popular writing that I do, like in Cosmic Connection, I try to do a first-person approach to try to convey that sense of things. But so you consider art and music.
Yeah.
There are areas where obviously the writer or the composer or the artist is deeply involved emotionally in what he does. And the composer is still considered ivory tower exercises by many people. So the ivory tower part has nothing to do with the emotions. It has to do with it being distant. If it's not easy to understand, then to hell with it.
Yeah.
Well, you see, the other side of the coin in the question of how do we responsibly deal with science and technology, I think the scientists and communications media have to better put over what they do. So I think it's clear that the public has to make a bigger intellectual effort to understand what's happening. And my view of it, having spent a lot of time the last few years in public lectures and television, popular writing and so on, is that that public interest is there.
Oh, there's no question.
And that the main problem is simply getting it across in a palatable form. But there certainly are some people who say, oh, science, I can never understand it, I'm too dumb, or something like that. And then, of course, if you have that view, you automatically reject it and give yourself an opportunity to understand it.
Would you say in the past scientists perhaps have been guilty in this respect that, like the Egyptian priests, they were not too anxious to have their terminology understood, and or didn't have time or something, and that's why it was kind of a sacred cow, and people felt, here are these fellows who don't really care about humanity just so they can do their own thing.
I don't think it was a conscious effort for fear anyone else would understand what the scientists did, but I think it involves a special kind of intellectual or emotional effort to explain in simple terms what you're doing. Okay? It's easier. I mean, when I teach, it's easier for me to talk to graduate students than to talk to undergraduate students. Why is that? Because the graduate students already talk the technical language. The undergraduate students don't. So I'm constantly seeking for analogies or easy ways of explaining slightly difficult subjects when I talk to the undergraduates. Easier to talk in the special language that has been developed to deal with the subject itself. And I think that's all it is. It's the same problem in describing any art. By the way, one point which I didn't want to let run by is that the creative experience in science, I think, is identical to the creative experience in art. That same marvelous feeling of having done something as you had originally conceived it, but it all flowed together. In the case of science, it's to have understood something that you didn't understand before, perhaps something that no one ever understood before, but at least that you didn't understand. And there's an immense satisfaction, which is a very exciting feeling, and which, by the way, anybody can have. You don't have to be Albert Einstein to get that feeling. You just have to have a certain kind of view about how to look at the world. And then every drop of water in the microscope gives you that sense of excitement. And that's a kind of very inexpensive and very profound pleasure.
It's
Which can
almost
be-
a religious thing, right, using that term. I mean, that's
Well,
what many
it-
people
it
get out of
is-
a religious
In a
activity.
certain sense, that's right. I mean,
Yeah.
if religion is the pursuit of awe, then I would say that science is merely a religious activity.
It's
If
what
that's
some
you
would
mean.
call a revelation.
Well, the
Inspiration.
trouble with revelation is that it's supposed to be a truth revealed to you and not testimony. Whereas with my microscope,
Yeah.
if I have this excitement about seeing the Volvox, I can poke my neighbor in his ribs with my elbow and have him look at and see Volvox.
Well, I guess I was talking about what Einstein called the leap of faith, where two guys can sit there. One will have this sudden thing, and the other one won't. That was
Okay.
almost a revelation to him.
Well, but notice that in science, but not in religion, there is now a second step.
It can
In
be
science,
tested.
Einstein can suddenly see that the contracted Riemann-Christoffel tensor, when set equal to 0, gives a stunning theory of gravitation. Okay, and isn't it amazing that the world can be constructed in such a way? Suppose I am absolutely skeptical. I think it's ridiculous that a contracted Riemann-Christoffel tensor can have anything to do with the world. However, there's now a thing I can do. I can work out the general relativistic field equation, which follow from that statement R sub ij equals 0, and observe that in the classical limit I have reproduced the Newtonian mechanics. And what's more, there are tests we can now make, the three classical tests of general relativity, to see if the departures from Newtonian mechanics are borne out. And if they are, I have to grudgingly admit that Einstein was right, despite the fact that I'm initially skeptical of tensor calculus or whatever. Well, there isn't a similar set of verification that occurs in religion. I cannot then do an experiment to see if it works. I simply have to accept the claim or not. It's like asking everybody to accept and worship R sub ij equals 0. Okay, well, not a physicist in the world would do it. Okay, you have to work out the consequences, do experiments, see if they confirm. That's the reason that there was this marvelous British expedition to look at the deflection of starlight during an eclipse near the sun. Planned at a time when they were at war with Germany. Einstein was a German citizen. But science transcended that international conflict. So there is an emotional similarity, but science has another step which religion doesn't. And in my view, that's the critical difference between the two subjects.
Now, some person might say, of course, if something only happens once, if it works for him once, as a religious belief, for example,
That's fine, but he should keep that to himself, since it has only worked once. There's no chance
Yeah.
of anyone else doing anything with it.
except that he could say it did work for him.
It's fine. You can certainly do that, but that is not the basis of a evangelical religion. Saying that here's this thing which once worked for me. Okay? The great world religions make claims of universality. Anytime you make a claim of universality, you have to be claiming it's tested. Okay? But a skeptic can do a thing which will convince you. In the framework of his skepticism. Science does that all the time.
I see what you're saying, which I haven't heard in exactly that way before, but it's certainly a more sweeping definition of science and its applicability to human problems than many people have said, and I think this is worth repeating. And I think I will certainly also use the idea that education, that the people need to know, and that the news media need to be aware that they have not fulfilled a certain obligation here, that they've been preoccupied with applications. I just kind of as a resume here, making sure I heard this correctly.
Yep, that's what I said. That the way in which scientists think is more important than the results of their thinking.
That we ought to spend a little time and money telling about this.
That's right. And apart from the social consequences, which are very deep, there's something exciting just about understanding. The act of understanding is itself an aesthetic experience.
This could be done in a great many disciplines.
Of course, absolutely. Not restricted to science.
Well, for many people it would not be a scientific thing, though. I don't think people really understand how widely applicable the method is.
Exactly.
And when they think of science, they think of chemistry and physics and a few other traditional ones instead of applying it in psychology and who knows where
Or
else.
checkers. You know, checkers.
Right.
Checkers is about science. You know,
Yeah.
if you can't figure it out deductively, you can do experiments and
Yeah.
discover that whatever it is. It's, you know, if you're in trouble, there's a particular corner where you can bob back and forth and they can't get you. You know, whatever it is, you can do an experiment.
Right. I was watching the Plato terminal last night. A very good friend of mine is operating that, and I know the people at Illinois who originated this thing, and it's amazing. It's amazing. Dog fights, everything else, based on well, and I went through the celestial mechanics game they have in it, where you make up your planets and the elements of the planet and watch it retrograde and everything. And I wish I had one of these in my class.
You had a phone.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I wonder,
My pleasure.
do you have a glossy, or can I take a slide or two for the article? Which way do you prefer?
Let's give you a glossy. I think we have some.
Okay. Do you have black and white or color or both? I don't know how much of this